Good morning. My name is Avi Go, and I'm the Clinic Director of the Metro Toronto Chinese and Southeast Asian Mayo Clinic. With me today, first of all, on my right is Mr. David Lepofsky, and he's the Human Rights Reform Representative of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance, which is AODA Alliance. And on my left is Professor Lauren Foster, and he teaches at York University Schools of Public Policy and Administration. Lauren has a very strong background in human rights and social justice issues. And we're here today because 48 hours ago, the McGuinty government privatized enforcement of human rights in Ontario. For almost a half-century, it was the role of the government in this province to publicly investigate and prosecute those who illegally discriminate contrary to the Human Rights Code. And this was done through the Ontario Human Rights Commission. The McGuinty government's controversial Bill 107, which was passed on December 2006, went into effect this past Monday in the middle of a holiday weekend and changed all that. As of this past Monday, victims of discrimination can no longer go to the Human Rights Commission to publicly investigate and prosecute their complaints. Instead, they must investigate and prosecute their own cases and enforce their own rights without it being spearheaded by a publicly funded law enforcement agency. Was the backlogged, underfunded human rights system great before June 30th, 2008? Definitely not. Was change needed? Definitely. But there was a huge debate in 2006 on which change would make things better or which would make it worse. Unfortunately, the government shut down that debate right in the middle with a closure motion, and the result is Bill 107. The vast majority of people who file human rights complaints every year are people with disabilities and people from racialized communities. And at least as much as anyone else, they needed reform to the human rights system in Ontario. And 2 days ago, the government held its ribbon-cutting festivities. Yet today, we're going to take a sober second look at what Ontarians are being promised, what they should demand, and what they should expect from this new system. And we're not going to present you with the government-crafted news kits, but instead we're giving you the internal government documents which David had obtained under the Freedom of Information Act. We have brought copies of the government staffing charge for the Human Rights Commission, the Human Rights Tribunal, and the Human Rights Legal Support Center. And we also have provided you with a set of key quotations on what the government has committed to Ontarians and some of the statements that were made by public officials that should give us pause as to whether or not they will be keeping all these commitments and promises. Our number one goal is a human rights system that will truly work for all victims of discrimination. We want this new system to work. However, we're very concerned that what we will end up is that all discrimination victims are not going to be getting the level of support that they need and were promised when they go up against government agencies or big private companies with deep pockets and lawyers on retainer. We are really worried that for many human rights victims, the new system will be too hard to navigate on their own. We're very fearful that the cases just will not get filed or will simply get abandoned. The current backlog will just be shuffled down the hall from the historically underfunded Human Rights Commission to the even more underfunded Human Rights Legal Support Center that will fill its role. Even worse, we fear that the current backlog will well be replaced by a group of silent victims of discrimination who will not have the support they need and will be left with even less justice than under the old system. And I'm going to turn to Mr. Lepofsky now, and he's going to talk about the legal support discrimination that victims need and what kind of support that they have been promised and what kind of support they will get.
Good morning, everyone. You will have available to you a list of 10 key commitments that we've tracked that the McGuinty government and its officials have made about what is supposed to be delivered to Ontarians under its reforms to the human rights system. You can pick up a copy, and every commitment is backed by a quotation or a source. We base this on what statements were made in the legislature, We base this on what Bill 107 itself promises or says, and we also base this on the content of a panel discussion at Community Living Ontario that took place on June 13th, involving myself from the community perspective and Ms. Kathy Laird, who is the Executive Director of the new Human Rights Legal Support Center. We've included some excerpts from that panel discussion where appropriate in that list of commitments. But if you want to hear the whole thing to make sure that we are getting it right and we are getting it fairly, you can download it from our website, and we've provided a link to the MP3 of that panel. Legal support is at the key or the center to our discussions today. The government made 10 important commitments to the community. Many pertain to the provision of legal support to victims of discrimination. This is what they committed, among other things. First, they committed to free, independent legal counsel to be provided to all victims of discrimination or complainants at the Human Rights Tribunal and through the Human Rights Tribunal process. They said this would be available regardless of the income of the individual seeking that free, independent lawyer. And the term they used was lawyer or legal counsel. They committed that this would be available across the province, not, I might add, just in Toronto. On behalf of the Legal Support Center, its Executive Director, Kathy Laird, at this panel a couple of weeks ago, committed that the Human Rights Legal Support Center will meet with every individual who asks for legal representation. And I note that the Human Rights Commission, beyond the 3,000 cases is projected to be at the tribunal this year or in each upcoming year, annually got tens of thousands of calls or contacts just making inquiries. We've also got a commitment from Ms. Laird at that same panel that the Human Rights Legal Support Center will pay for the cost of expert witnesses for clients they represent. Expert witnesses are very important in a number of human rights cases, and indeed in many disability cases, for example. She also committed that the Human Rights Legal Support Center will investigate cases for their clients. Now, there are other commitments, and our Professor Foster will talk about some of those as they relate to the Human Rights Commission. Let me take a moment to talk to you about why this issue of legal representation is so important. If an individual who says that they are the victim of discrimination is going to proceed to a hearing on that claim before the new court, the court that will hear it, the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal, it's a court-like tribunal, if they're going to go and face a contested hearing against a party they've accused of discrimination, they absolutely need to have a lawyer there to represent them. Why do I say that? Well, for one thing, I can tell you from personal experience. I personally have fought not one, but 2 cases against the Toronto Transit Commission. I am a lawyer. And believe me, I got a sense at a personal level of what kind of battle you can face just to fight for something as simple as getting the buses or streetcars or subways to tell you all the names of the stops that you're at. The TTC spent, got this revealed through a Freedom of Information request as well, $450,000 on lawyers combined to fight those 2 lawsuits. Many, if not most, people accused of discrimination at the Human Rights Tribunal will come with lawyers. Will they all spend that amount of money? Can't say they will, but too many will, or too many will have at least spent a substantial amount to hire lawyers to defend themselves. An individual who alleges discrimination, who goes to that tribunal and has to prove their case, face cross-examination, and so on, will be absolutely at sea if they try to do it without a lawyer representing them. Now, that alone would be difficult enough at the current system. Under the current system, when a case went to the tribunal, and we agreed that too few did. But under the current system, at least when cases went to the tribunal, it was after they were investigated and vetted by the Human Rights Commission, and they involved public government-funded legal counsel for the Human Rights Commission playing the role of public prosecutor. And as Avi said, not under this new system. How else do we know that you're going to need lawyers? The tribunal has now announced new rules that will govern how these hearings are going to be conducted. They are complicated rules. They involve about 20 or more different possible legal forms you're going to have to be familiar with. And believe me, trying to tackle and understand those rules without being supported by a lawyer is going to be a fool's errand. It will be a high-risk exercise. But don't just take it from us. Take it from the very experts on human rights reform that the Ontario and federal governments turned to in the 90s for advice, and who the McGuinty government said they're listening to. Mary Cornish, Toronto human rights lawyer, wrote one report at the Ontario government's request. Former Supreme Court Justice Gérald Laforêt wrote one for the federal government. Both of them identified the importance of discrimination victims having representation at human rights tribunal hearings. The document with the 10 commitments you have include those quotes. Moreover, even if you don't want to take it from them, you can even listen to the number of proponents who supported Bill 107, even they, when they came before the Standing Committee of the Legislature, before closure was invoked and those promised hearings were shut down, many of their comments supported the need for legal representation at the tribunal level. So then, let me turn to the obvious question. The obvious question is, are they going to be able to deliver on this? We have very serious concerns that they're going to be able to deliver on this commitment. Yes, some will get legal representation, but that's not what they promised. They promised it for all. Lawyers for all. Why are we concerned? What is the basis of our concern? Well, we have several. First, I attended the budget lockup last March and asked government representatives what the budget would be for the Human Rights Legal Support Center. And I was told at the time that the budget for this upcoming year was going to be $4.6 million. That is about a third, and certainly less than a half, of the budget of the Human Rights Commission. And if the Human Rights Commission was backlogged, delayed, and incapable of handling in a timely way its caseload, it is impossible to see how the Legal Support Center will be able to do more with substantially less. Not only do we expect that there's going to be unrepresented people going to the Human Rights Tribunal, the Human Rights Tribunal itself is projecting that there will be some parties coming forward unrepresented. In designing their rules and the materials supporting them, they are planning for the realistic expectation that some discrimination victims will be unrepresented. The question will come up, how many hearings will the Legal Support Center be able to handle per year? We know that they expect 3,000 complainants per year to go to the tribunal. How many hearings? And they've also been promised a hearing within a year if they don't want to settle their case. How many can the tribunal the Legal Support Center handle? At that June 13th panel I referred to, involving the executive director of that clinic, I asked that very question: how many hearings will your center be able to handle? And the answer was that she couldn't say, and that's 2 weeks before they were opening their doors. What did we learn from our Freedom of Information application? You've got their organization chart in front of you. It lists 9 legal counsel positions at the Human Rights Legal Support Center. 9 legal counsel to provide legal advice and lawyer representation, that's what was promised, to the projected 3,000 complainants per year and the tens of thousands more who may call for advice. That alone, simple math, can't work. But if you either have heard government statements lately, including, from what I'm told, at the ribbon cutting on Monday, though I wasn't there. I just heard. But also from what Ms. Laird said at the panel we had on June 13th, the Legal Support Center's public statement is that they're going to have 19 lawyers. Now, the document you have there is one that was given out, we were told, to the Human Rights Commission staff in April, just after the Ontario budget, and I believe about a day or two after the government announced in a news release what its funding was going to be, what new funding it was injecting into the system. So this is information they released to staff in the current system at a point in time after they'd set the budget for the province and after they'd publicly announced the funding that they were going to add to this system. Now, there's a bit of a discrepancy here between the 9 legal counsel position they've got and the 19 lawyers that Ms. Laird said they're going to have. Now, by the way, 19 lawyers working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, still couldn't provide all the legal representation annually that was promised. But in any event, I asked the question at that panel, and again, you can listen to the MP3 if you need to hear the exchanges about this of Ms. Laird, of where the 19 comes from. And it turns out that there are 9 legal counsel positions. There's another class of position which on the organization chart is called legal support workers. She, at the panel, said it wasn't going to be called that. It'll be called something else, legal services representative. And they will be open to people to apply for whether they are a lawyer or not, i.e. to apply to work in this job. It is not a job designed for and exclusively limited to legal counsel. It is a job that can be filled by a lawyer or a paralegal or other people with some experience doing advocacy. It turns out that they seem to be offering a number of those jobs, 9 or so she said a couple of weeks ago, to people who happen to be lawyers. We are confused. These are lawyers being put in jobs that are not designated as legal counsel, which are not being paid as lawyers. We don't know what their situation will be relative to the Law Society, whether they will be representing themselves to their clients as lawyers. All we know is that some kind of new class of people, work position, which is something below the standard that they themselves call legal counsel. But numbers aside in terms of what you call them, they still won't be able to provide the full representation that we were promised with those kind of numbers, unless the hearings are extremely short and are not particularly effectively presented, we are concerned. Now then, there are other reasons why we have these concerns. Let me just cover these very briefly. The government promised that that the Legal Support Center that they're establishing will provide legal services across Ontario. From what we've been told, they are only opening an office in Toronto. If you ask what kind of how are they going to deliver legal services to the majority of Canadians, or pardon me, of Ontarians who live outside Toronto, the answer that we got, we've been getting for months, and that we got from Ms. Laird a couple of weeks ago is that they're going to be working out some kind of arrangements with legal clinics or private lawyers on some kind of terms to handle cases outside Toronto. We still don't have any particulars on this. We don't know how many, we don't know how often, we don't know how quickly. We just still don't know, and they've had a year and a half to set this up. And we've been asking these kind of questions, by the way, of the government since Bill 107 was introduced, and still since Bill 107 was passed. The Legal Support Center committed to provide investigations for their clients. Now, there's 2 problems with this. Number one, look at the organization chart. They don't have any investigators. They do have positions called legal support workers or legal representatives or something, but if they're all tied up answering the tens of thousands of phone calls that they're going to be getting per year, and handling the 3,000 cases that are going to be entitled to a hearing if they don't settle, then it's going to be difficult to see how they're also going to double as a team of investigators. The other problem is that the Legal Support Center does not have any investigation powers. The old Human Rights Commission did. It had investigators that had the power to get search warrants, to go into buildings, to interview people, and so on, and it was an offense to obstruct their investigation. No such thing for the legal support centers people, whoever it turns out to be their investigators. Let me just talk about one other consideration that bears on this question of legal representation. And this is no small consideration. We don't know how the Legal Support Center is going to decide which cases they're going to take and which they're going to turn away. We do know from statements by the person that was hired by the government, a woman named Helena Burt, to set up the Legal Support Center, that they will be expecting to have to turn some cases away or just, in some cases, give people advice on here's how to go do it yourself. My words, not hers. Or here's a briefing on how to handle a mediation. Here's some information and tips, go do it yourself. We won't be going with you. Some people will get full legal representation. Some people will get a lawyer. Some people will get a non-lawyer. And some people won't get anything at all. What we don't know, what hasn't been made public, is what process they're going to use to decide which cases they take and which cases they turn away. And I asked Ms. Laird at that program, at that panel a couple of weeks ago, whether or not the Legal Support Center, when they do turn someone away, if they do turn someone away, whether they'll give them written reasons about why they won't take the case. She had said that they'll turn them away, perhaps, for example, if the Legal Support Center decides the case has no merit. I said, will you give the individual your reasons in writing? And there was no commitment to do so. She said she didn't yet know. That's for all the newcomers. Let me take one more moment to talk about the existing people in the current system. There are upwards, we understand, of 4,000 people with their cases in the current backlog before the Human Rights Commission. What happens with them? They've got a choice right now. They can stay with the commission and try to get their case finished there, but the commission's only got 6 months to do that. Under Bill 107, once 6 months is up, no matter what's been invested in preparing the case and working on the case, after the 6 months is up, if the case isn't resolved, then subject to some very complicated transition rules that give all of us a headache. Basically, you're out of luck and you got to go start at the tribunal all over again. But people in the current system now have a choice. They can also opt to jump into the new system right now, to go to the Human Rights Tribunal right now, to leave the Human Rights Commission and jump into a new expedited process at the tribunal. Well, the decision of whether to make that jump for those 4,000 people who've been in the old system for months or years, who've trusted the government to keep that system alive but had it changed in the middle, the decision whether to jump to the new system or stay in the old system for those 6 months is a complicated decision for which independent legal advice is required. If you go to the website of the Human Rights Legal Support Center, the quotation is on our list of 10 commitments there, by the way, the Legal Support Center has decided that they will not be providing legal advice to those over 4,000 people on that important decision for which they so desperately will need legal advice. So much for the promise of free government lawyers for everybody at the tribunal. We intend, in conclusion, before I pass it back over to Lauren, or pardon me, to Avi, we intend not just to raise these as concerns, but to monitor this. We are not telling people don't use the system, much the contrary. We are urging anyone who feels they are the victim of discrimination to call the Human Rights Legal Support Center and to call there now. Ask for the free lawyer they were promised. We've also are asking people to let us know what they found. Did it work? Did they get what they were promised? And we've set up a new email address for people to let us know. And you'll see that email address in the news release that you've got in front of you. So we are encouraging people to use the system. If they're able to get legal services, great. And if they're not, that the government should be held accountable with respect to their promises.
Thank you. And as I've mentioned earlier, most of the cases that the Commission received every year are from people with disabilities and people from the racialized communities. And if you look at the annual reports, in fact, they made up about 80% of all the complaints that were received every year by the Commission. And these communities are also among the poorest in our province, and therefore they are the ones who need free legal service the most. And so they will be the one who will be turning to the Legal Support Center. And speaking from someone who has worked with the Commission on race-based complaints. And most of these cases, as David says, are very systemic in nature. And in fact, I would say that every race-based complaint has a systemic component. And so it's important to have proper legal representation. It is also important to have experts' opinions in some cases, which right now, under the old system, the Commission pays for the experts if we go to the tribunal, which is something that, the individual complainants may not be able to do. And also for people with disabilities and racialized groups, there may be other accommodation issues as well. For instance, they may need sign language accommodation, and for many racialized communities, they need interpretations for their first language. So we really want to know how the new Human Rights Support Center is going to provide all those services with 1/3 of the budget that the Commission had received before. But there are other issues concerning the new system, which Lauren is going to talk about, Professor Foster is going to talk about with respect to the Human Rights Commission.
Good morning, everyone. So what about the Human Rights Commission? The government made important commitments about it. They said that under Bill 107, the Human Rights Commission would be freed up to devote its resources to bringing forward public interest cases without having to devote its resources to handling individual discrimination cases. What is really happening? Well, we've learned from the Human Rights Commission organization chart, which we're making public today, that the Human Rights Commission's resources are not being freed up to redirect to the investigation and litigation of public interest cases. Much, if not most, of the resources are being taken away from the Human Rights Commission. We predicted this 2 years ago. The Commission is being shrunk or diminished from a high point of around 200 staff to only about 60 positions in the new world of Bill 107. It will be a shadow of its former self. How effective will this gutted Human Rights Commission be at investigating public interest cases? Well, you cannot litigate them without a good investigation. And under the new organization chart, we've learned that the Human Rights Commission will have a grand total of 3 investigators for an entire province of Ontario. Most of the current investigation staff will be gone from this role. This is a hollow symbolism. Just as an aside, I'm reminded of the beginning of the Human Rights Commission in 1961-62 when Dr. Dan Hill became the first director of the Human Rights Commission. He was a one-man show for a while. He did his own investigations. He used to carry around the files in the back of his trunk. I think that we might call this current incarnation of the Commission back to the future. Now, instead of one investigator, after 47 years, 100,000 immigrants a year, and 145 languages later, the province has 3. I think Dr. Hill would be somewhat disappointed with his legacy and a little disappointed with what the McGuinty government is calling progress and modernization. In fact, I've argued in the past that it amounts to a policy of erosion, not inclusion. It is an incremental degradation of benefits and services that have taken 47 years to accrue. Using the term progress to define a restriction of public services is an outright misleading and potentially harmful statement, and harmful to a diverse society. It's a retreat from the complexities of our province and our society. What we see in the new system is that the old gatekeeper is being replaced by a new gatekeeper, as David so aptly informed us, namely the Human Rights Legal Support Center. It's going to decide if you get a lawyer or if you don't get a lawyer from the discrimination victim, or for the discrimination victim, excuse me, whether the Human Rights Commission turns you down or the new gatekeeper, the Human Rights Legal Support Center, turns you down, you are for all practical purposes out of luck. For the government to tell somebody you can bring your own case without a lawyer is a hollow formality and not a meaningful right. In the 60 years of the formal human rights movement in Ontario, the province has changed dramatically in terms of demographic complexity. Ontario has been redrawn along linguistic, cultural, ethno-racial, and ability lines. Society is filled with new complexities. Because of this, we've always argued that the McGuinty government should not retreat from the complexities of society. Instead, if the province is going to develop a coherent set of prescriptions for progressive change to the system of human rights protections, it needs to listen in order to have the nuanced understanding of the interests of Ontario's diverse communities. When the McGuinty government was making its case to the public about Bill 107 in 2006, one of the big selling points about being sensitive to diversity and showing that it really means business about battling racism and disability discrimination was that it was committed to set up the Human Rights Commission 2 new offices, an anti-racism secretariat and a disability rights secretariat. The government is legally required to set up these according to Section 31 of Bill 107. If you look at the Human Rights Commission's organization chart that you know how you shall have access to, you will see no mention of either of these offices. David Lepofsky and I both called the Commission Monday to ask for them, and we were both told they don't have any. At the time, we thought the promises of those secretariats was window dressing, but we stood to be proven wrong. Well, if none are established, 18 months after the government legally committed itself to establish them, they don't even rise to the threshold of window dressing. Unless we're mistaken, the government seems to be disregarding its own law. And now I want to turn it over to David to continue.
Just 1 minute on one other issue. Some of you may know of my involvement leading the movement for over a decade to get a strong Disability Act passed. This past Monday, with the coming into force of Bill 107, the McGuinty government has also broken an important understanding it reached with the disability community regarding that law. When in opposition, the McGuinty Liberals properly assailed the Harris government because they provided a weak Disability Act with no effective enforcement. Premier McGuinty promised us in the 2003 election that he would be different. He would pass a new Disability Act with effective enforcement. When he got elected, his minister, Marie Butriani, sat down to negotiate with us the content of that law. We asked for a new enforcement agency, independent enforcement agency. The government told us they weren't going to provide that, but they said that we would continue to have access to the Human Rights Commission as the investigator and prosecutor of such discrimination cases. I believe to this day that Minister Butriani was speaking in good faith when she said that. We didn't get everything we wanted, but we shook hands on the deal, and I sat at this very place in the spring of 2005 to commend the McGuinty government on the Disability Act. What happened a year later is a different minister came along and effectively broke the understanding, yanked the rug out from underneath it, just as they were going to yank the enforcement teeth out of the Human Rights Commission. And that's what went into effect this past Monday. And we are left with a weakened Disabilities Act and a broken understanding about the continued availability of the Human Rights Commission. Davey?
So I guess that David had mentioned earlier, we will monitoring the situation, and we are urging people to contact the new support center to seek help. And we do hope that we can be proven wrong, and so we'll all celebrate, a successful new system. However, we also call on the media to monitor the situation as well, and not to just take the government's words or even our words for it. You see for yourself whether the new system is working or not. So that's the end of the formal part of the conference.